is episode 66 of the Real World Wellness Podcast. Hi everyone, I'm Christine Lehman, a nutritional therapy practitioner and the reverse diabetes coach, which is also the name of my website. I help clients reverse chronic conditions naturally through diet, exercise, and stress management. I see clients virtually, so we don't have to be in the same city or even the same country. I'm offering a special free 60-minute nutrition consult only this month using the online platform ringwell.com. Email me at christine@reversediabetescoach.com and I'll send you the registration instructions. I only have 5 of these coupons and you need to book your appointment by December 22nd. Please remember while you're listening to the show, advice and information we provide is intended to be helpful and informative, but is not a substitute for medical advice or treatment. I'm really delighted to have Maria Noël Groves back on the podcast today, and you can hear the first part of our discussion in episode 63. For those of you who have not listened to that episode, I'm going to introduce Maria again. She is a registered clinical herbalist who runs the Wintergreen Botanicals Herbal Clinic and Education Center, nestled in the pine forests of New Hampshire. She has been working with herbs for more than 2 decades, is certified by Michael Moore's Southwest School of Botanical Medicine, is a registered professional herbalist with the American Herbalist Guild, and has also completed Rosemary Gladstar's advanced training program and Lycanwood Herbal's flower essence practitioner training. Her business is devoted to education and empowerment via classes, health consultations, and writing with the foundational belief that good health grows in nature. She is the author of Body into Balance, an Herbal Guide to Holistic Self Care, a regular contributor to Herb Quarterly and other holistic publications, and she's also the founder of the NH, or New Hampshire Herbal Network. You can learn more about Maria and herbs at her website, which is wintergreenbotanicals.com. So welcome back, Maria.
Thanks so much for having me back.
Yeah. Well, we have a great discussion, and I'm looking forward to what I'm kind of calling part 2 here. And we're
going to get into the fun stuff now.
Yeah, really. I think the heavy duty stuff, focusing on digestion, elimination, and detoxification. So let's get started. Can you set the stage by just explaining a little bit about the GI tract? I know that it runs north to south, but what's the difference between the upper GI and the lower GI?
Sure, and I want to say, too, that digestion is such an important facet of health. And the way my book is organized by body system and digestion, and then we start off with the more foundational systems that I think impact a lot of other aspects of health beyond that exact system. And so digestion is early in the book because it is one of those foundational systems of health.
Absolutely.
And I do sometimes like to think of the digestive system in 2 separate parts. We have the upper GI and the lower GI, and the upper GI is kind of like your mouth down through your stomach and maybe a little bit past your stomach. And the main goal of that part of your digestive system is to break the food down. And we do that mechanically by, chewing with our mouth, by churning with our stomach, and then we also do that chemically with enzymes that are present especially in our mouth, some in our stomach, and then especially right outside the stomach when food comes out of the stomach. There is a flood of digestive enzymes that are squirted out from the pancreas that come into contact with that sort of semi-broken down food. So we get enzymes. We also have other compounds like hydrochloric acid in the stomach that really work they're very potent for breaking down food chemically. And then the lower GI is more focused in the small intestine. We do a lot of assimilation and absorbing that into the body. And I like to think of it as food kind of going along a little conveyor belt in a factory. And you have different parts of the intestines that are geared to absorb different things. And so then they ultimately are going to make their way into the bloodstream and into the body. And the body will use that food that's been broken down into its smallest piece possible to reconstruct them into fuel, into structure, into chemicals like hormones. We use cholesterol and fats to make hormones. We use fats to make our cell lining. Protein is a really big one. When we break that down into amino acids, we use that to do a lot of the structures and neurotransmitters and other compounds in our body. And carbohydrates particularly tend to end up being mostly fuel. So, we've got those macronutrients, and we also have all those micronutrients and other compounds that we get from our food and our herbs and things that we consume. And then further down in our lower GI, in the large intestine, it's kind of like wringing the water out of a wet towel. And so whatever's been absorbed that is ideal for being absorbed has been. And so now we're just kind of pulling the water out of that chyme or that mix of food that's been mostly broken down and eliminating whatever's left. And so that's why we end up, if things are moving too slowly, then we get more constipated because more water gets pulled out in that phase. And if things are moving too quickly, we end up with more watery stools because not as much water is being pulled out. But ideally, we're kind of somewhere in between, and we eliminate out, whatever we didn't need from our food. But also in that process, when the enzymes are coming out of the pancreas, we also squirt bile out via our gallbladder from our liver, and that's the waste of the liver. And that has two benefits. One, it helps you digest your fat better. It breaks it up into smaller pieces. And then two, it's the waste of the liver, so it's getting toxins out of the body that the liver has filtered out. And so that will also go out in your feces, and it's actually what makes your feces brown. Are some of the compounds in that. So that's kind of the basic rundown of what's happening, of breaking things down and then absorbing things and then eliminating the waste.
Yeah, so it all starts with your senses. And
definitely.
And so you call that pre-digestion. So if you could actually read that first paragraph, or I can do it, of pre-digestion, I like the way you wrote that.
Sure. So just the first paragraph. So you should have a Pavlovian response to food. The sight of a colorful salad, the scent and sizzle of a skillet excite the brain and flip the switches into the digestive tract. Saliva pours into your mouth, your stomach pumps out starter acid, and your pancreas gears up to release enzymes. Unless your food response to food is for some reason diminished, a lack of sensory response creates a dull digestive function. So basically that just means that before we even ingest the food, our senses should be taking that in and getting geared up. And we also gear up in as we're chewing our food, that also sends signals down to our body on what's coming down the pike. And if our senses are dulled because we're stressed or just desensitized to food because we eat too much, or maybe you're a cook and you cook too much, those things can diminish our ability to digest and utilize our food because we're not primed for it from the get-go.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that you noted that some restaurant workers and head chefs are desensitized to food, and I was wondering, why is that?
It's because you're exposing your senses to food on such a frequent basis. You're around the sights and the smells, and you might also be tasting them, and that's normally, for the everyday person, you shouldn't be exposed to that. When you see and smell food and you have a little taste, it's because you're about to eat. But if you work in that environment, you're constantly exposed to those sensory inputs, and so your body, like in any time, it's an adaptive response to help us from being too overwhelmed with life, that eventually those don't become cues to eat anymore. And so when you do want to eat, your sensory responses might not be quite as good. So, one of the things you could do is focus on relaxing before you eat, and another would be maybe using a different set of spices that you don't normally work with at work, or maybe having somebody else be the cook, so you're not, in that chef role when it's time for you to eat, so somebody else is kind of treating you to food. So those are just some things. And it doesn't just happen to restaurant workers, it can also happen to whoever's the primary person who cooks at home. If it's a mom or a dad, the at-home parent, and they're constantly exposed to food, then after a while food is more of a chore than something that they're really gaining joy from.
Yes. Sounds like they have sensory overload and maybe food cooking overload.
Yes, and I think for a bigger group of people, probably the main reason why that pre-digestion might be hampered would be some stress. Because when we're under a lot of stress, digestion really doesn't matter that much. It's not, if you're fighting or flighting the saber-toothed tiger, it doesn't really matter what you ate or what you're going to eat. So naturally, all those systems of sensory input, and then also digestion just slow right down. And so that's a major cause for a lot of people for why their digestive systems are not functioning optimally, is that stress has kind of shut them down.
Absolutely. And one thing that I learned in my training was the importance of getting into the parasympathetic mode. And I just have a little trick that I use with clients, which is to take, several deep breaths before they actually eat. And that has a way of just calming your nervous system down. But I know you have other herbal remedies. So can you talk about some digestive herbs?
Sure, and what you're talking about is so simple and so easy, and that's great. There are, so in general, to stimulate digestion, digestive bitter herbs, so herbs that taste bitter, and foods that taste bitter too will stimulate digestion. But we have a category within those digestive bitters that I like to call relaxing bitters, and so they're herbs that also kind of calm our nervous system down a little bit while having somewhat of a bitter taste and a bitter action to stimulate digestion at the same time. And so a lot of these are herbs you've already heard about for digestion. The big one is chamomile. Chamomile is a fantastic, relaxing, bitter herb, and the longer you steep it, the more bitter it is. Sometimes people don't steep it for very long on purpose so that it doesn't get unpalatably bitter. And another one, especially for people who have flower allergies that may not tolerate chamomile blossoms very well, then we have some things from the mint family like catnip. It's an excellent herb, very similar in its properties to chamomile for relaxing spasms in the gut when people are having a lot of gas and bloating, but at the same time stimulating digestive juices and relaxing the nervous system. And then another one would be lemon balm. And all of these are pleasant enough that you can have them as a tea. Some of the more traditional basic bitters like artichoke leaves are really, really nasty bitter. And so people wouldn't drink a whole cup of tea of those herbs. It would be, just be very, very unpalatable, and you might even get nauseous from that. Those you usually would take in like a little dropper full of some elixir or something like that. But the things like chamomile and catnip, you can add a little mint to them to perk up their flavor if you want to. Those are pleasant enough that you could have a nice cup of tea. And just having a cup of tea has been proven to be relaxing for the body. It doesn't even matter what the tea is, but just having a warm glass of something and sipping it creates that ritual, kind of like taking those deep breaths to get us back into our body and to calm down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was watching a British series last night, and as you know, they like to have tea. Almost any occasion, they'll say, "Would you like a cup of tea?"
Yeah, tea is wonderful. I think it's one of those things that we just forget about in the United States. It's not part of our culture. We have coffee, and coffee has its perks, but tea, I think, and especially herbal teas, can be really phenomenal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would think that's more healing than coffee.
Generally, and coffee has its benefits too, but probably it is a digestive bitter. Besides that, I don't think it's so great for the digestive system because it stimulates that stress response, and that's kind of counterintuitive for digestion. But as a bitter, it does stimulate digestion to some extent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So is there a difference between sours and bitters, or they pretty much do the same thing?
They're not exactly the same. Sometimes I lump them together because generally things that taste sour and things that taste bitter do some similar things. They do kind of kick up digestive juices. Bitters probably have a little bit more profound of an action on peristalsis, which is that wave-like motion that moves food through the digestive tract from top to bottom. And bitters are probably a little bit more profound on that. And they also tend to lower the blood sugar response to food, both sours and bitters. So some of the studies that have been done on sours would be on grapefruit and weight loss and helping with curbing appetite and improving blood sugar response. And then also vinegar. There have been several studies on different types of vinegars, and those also seem to do a nice job with, if you have them with something that's high carbohydrate, your blood sugar response is actually a little bit better. It has less of a sugar response as it goes through, so you don't have that spike. And so they do kind of have those similarities, but bitters have a more profound benefit for digestion and for liver detoxification than sours, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Now you also have a nice recipe for bitter spray, and I was wondering, when would you use that, or how would you use it?
So there's a recipe in the book, and that has a couple different bitters. And usually when you have a digestive bitters as a spray, or sprays are handy because you can just squirt them right in your mouth, almost like you would a breath freshener. Or you can put them in like a little dropper bottle and mix a little bit of that in some water and take it by mouth. They're cordials, a lot of digestive bitter cordials. So you can take them in different ways, usually just having a little bit. And there are many of them on the market. A lot of our classic bitters are out there in the liquor stores, but those usually have a lot of artificial flavors and colors. So I would seek them out more in the natural food store in the digestive section. Urban Moonshine is a really excellent company that makes bitters. So you would use these bitters just as you're about to eat, or ideally a little bit before you're eating as you're starting to sit down. But if you have them while you're eating or just after you're eating, that's fine too. So it's not that you have to have it exactly 20 minutes before, and if not that, then don't bother. It's really at any point in time during that mealtime process should be beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just noticing in the recipe it talks about covering the mix with 75% vodka and 25% maple syrup or honey. But does that get drained out again or strained when you strain out the herbs? You don't end up with the vodka?
No, the vodka is part of it. So when you strain everything out, so in the recipe we're using a combination of dandelion root, lemon balm, which are classic bitters, artichoke leaf is another bitter, and then we have some sours in there. So Berry, it would be a sour, and then there's also a whole grapefruit or an orange, including the peel, and that's also kind of a bitter and a sour combined. And then we have a few carminatives, and that's pretty classic for bitter formulas. They're not just bitter; they usually have a few other flavor profiles in there. And carminatives are usually our more warming spices. Sometimes they relax spasms in the gut. They have that digestive benefit there, but they also kind of warm up the inherently cold nature of bitters. Bitters on an energetic level are kind of cold, and so we like to balance them with those warming spices. So in this particular recipe, I'm using some fennel seed and cardamom to kind of balance out those bitters, and it also gives it some flavor, and some ginger as well. And so those are the herbs. You cover them with vodka and maple syrup or honey. The maple syrup and honey are totally optional. It's just going to sweeten it, make it a little bit more palatable.
Mm-hmm.
And as they steep, it extracts the alcohol, especially, is going to extract those properties out of the plants that we want, all those flavors and medicinal benefits. And then when you strain it out after a couple of weeks, now you have a mixture that's basically vodka and honey or maple syrup, but it's also pulled out those properties of the plant.
I see.
And so you do have alcohol in that final. If you didn't want to have alcohol, glycerin is sometimes used as a substitute, or even vinegar. Vinegar bitters I don't think taste particularly great, but vinegar does have its own digestive benefits, so you could certainly make a vinegar-based or vinegar honey-based bitter formula if you wanted to avoid using alcohol.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good to know. So you do have a caution here. Let's talk just a minute about acid, stomach acid, and what you would use for low stomach acid, which is what I think we've been talking about, versus high stomach acid.
Sure, most people have low stomach acid, especially in our culture, because we eat such a not so great diet. That's going to diminish our stomach acid, and because of our stress levels, those two things dramatically diminish our stomach acid. And then sometimes people end up with reflux, and you would think that the reflux is because the stomach acid is high, but sometimes it's actually because the stomach acid is low, and because the stomach acid is not really responding to food appropriately, it's not signaling for the sphincter above the stomach to shut. And so people might end up with reflux from that, just because that sphincter that should be shut is open, and then as the stomach is turning away, even though there's not a lot of acid, what is there is splashing up and causing a problem. So for those folks, taking a digestive bitter or a sour vinegar, those things often make them feel better, because it's increasing stomach acid and everything kind of works better, digestive system works better, and everything's great. There are a few people who have high stomach acid, and those folks may find that bitters and especially sours do upset their stomach more. That if you take vinegar and it makes you feel worse, then don't take vinegar anymore. It may or may not, but it's generally an indication that maybe your stomach acid is too high. And they can do tests to test whether or not your stomach acid is high or low, but most doctors don't. They usually just prescribe a proton pump inhibitor like Prilosec, and that's going to shut down your stomach acid, which will help prevent the damage. But when we shut down our stomach acid, it's shutting it down by approximately 90%. Now we're not going to absorb our foods as well, because we're not doing that chemical breakdown that the stomach acid does. And so we end up with long-term use, we end up with a lot of nutrient deficiencies. And for people who have low stomach acid to begin with, it's even more inappropriate to use those kinds of medications. And so there are herbs that we can use that will help address things in a more holistic way than a lot of the medications will. And so bitters would be something we might use where there really is low stomach acid, but if anybody notices that bitters make them feel worse, maybe they have worse heartburn, they have stomach aches, then those will be signs that that's not really appropriate. And so other herbs might be more appropriate in that case.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some of those soothing gut healing herbs.
Yeah, and so I feel like the soothing gut healing herbs are appropriate almost no matter what, but we'd especially consider them when somebody is noticing that they're reacting negatively to those, sour and bitter flavors, and just when they have a lot of inflammation and irritation in the gut. So this can be anywhere in the gut, from the upper to the lower GI. So maybe they've got leaky gut, these herbs are still useful. If they've got ulcers, these herbs are still useful. If they've got heartburn of any type, these herbs are still useful. So generally we're looking at slimy, soothing, healing herbs. Licorice is a classic, and it works amazingly well. It both has some slimy, soothing properties that kind of replaces some of the mucosal lining of the gut. That buffers it well. It also encourages your body to make more of the mucosal lining, because we're supposed to have mucus on our intestines and kind of throughout the whole GI, but especially in our stomach, we should have a really thick coat of mucus, because the stomach should have a lot of acid in it, and acid is really harsh, so that mucus protects the rest of the body from that acid. And so licorice not only creates a sort of temporary buffer of acid, but it also helps your body, encourage your body to produce more of that mucus all throughout, but especially in the stomach. And then it also has some antimicrobial effects. So if there's a bacteria like H. pylori and ulcers is oftentimes associated there, it does have some anti-H. pylori activity as well. So licorice, and it promotes healing in other ways. So it's a great herb. The downside is that licorice has some negative side effects long term. It can mess with your sodium and potassium balance, which can mess with your blood pressure. It can irritate the kidneys long term, and there are some liver toxic components to licorice too, especially in high doses or long term, or if it's not very good quality product. So when I use licorice, I'm usually just using a small amount of it, usually in a tea or chewable capsules or something where you're actually consuming it in its more pure form, not pills, because pills are probably not going to release very well. So something, that you're actually consuming it in its basic form. So you can use that, or you can use DGL, and those are really popular, really easy. They're great for things like acid reflux and ulcers. It's much better, more holistic perspective than using things like Rolaids or things that actually affect the stomach acid more directly. And that has had the glycyrrhizin removed, which is the compound that tends to cause the negative effects of licorice. It's not necessarily more medicinal. If anything, it's kind of like a dumbed-down licorice, but it's safer. So for people who are concerned with having licorice in their tea as a regular licorice substance, so you can get these chewable DGL tablets, DGL chewables, and those can be really useful.
Where can people get those?
You can just get those in most natural food stores will carry them in the digestive section, especially if you're shopping at like a co-op or a really well-stocked natural food store. You'll usually find them. And you can find them online too. There are many different brands. Enzymatic therapy is one of the ones that I really like, but there are plenty of other brands too. I know Natural Factors is another one, and you can just look around and look at the other ingredients in the product just to make sure, usually they have some kind of a sweetener that you can choose over whether it's sugar or fructose or sugar alcohol, and kind of pick the one that works best for you.
Yeah, I was glad you mentioned original throat coat tea, because I love that from traditional medicinals, and of course use it when I have a sore throat, but I noticed that it has some of the licorice and other ingredients in there as well.
Yeah, the throat coat tea is great. It's not really designed for stomach acid. It's designed for a sore throat, but it's the same principle. Your throat tissue and your digestive tissue are basically the same. The throat is part of the digestive tract, and so a lot of the herbs that soothe and heal that will also soothe and heal other parts of the gut. The one ingredient that's not really specific for the gut in that formula is the cherry bark, which is a really great cough suppressant, and that really doesn't have a direct purpose in the digestive system. But in a pinch, you could definitely use throat coat tea to ease your gut. And there are other great herbs in there too, not just licorice, but we also have other slimy, soothing herbs. Marshmallow root is one of my favorites. You can also use marshmallow leaf or flower. And then slippery elm is another really popular herb too. That's the slippery elm bark. And those all get really slimy in water. And they don't have quite the dynamics, that broader picture that licorice has, but they're really nice as slimy, soothing herbs, and they're also very safe. So those are ones that I tend to focus more. So I might have like 40 to 50% marshmallow root in a tea blend, and maybe only like 5 or 10% licorice, and then I'll throw in whatever other ingredients I want to for the person.
Well, that sounds good. I was noticing too under your marshmallow root section here that you talk about it as a powdered root that you can add to oatmeal or gruel.
Yeah, any of those herbs you can get them powdered and then add them to food, and that's another great way to take them. Add it to water, especially, or food like oatmeal is always kind of soothing and slimy, and then you can consume them. And marshmallow powder, as well as slippery elm powder, taste pretty decent. They're not unpleasant, and so you can definitely mix them with a little spice to make them taste even better and add them to foods and recipes. They do get a kind of snot-like consistency to them, because that's what we're going for. We want to be replacing mucus. So they do get a very mucusy consistency, which can be off-putting, but if you add them to something that's already kind of slimy by nature, like oatmeal or a smoothie, then that might make it a little bit more palatable. The powders are going to get much, much more slimy than the teas made with a cut and sifted herb, and that's more therapeutic. But if that's a little too much slime for somebody, then they could just use the cut and sifted herb and make a tea with it, and that would be fine as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, I noticed you also mentioned drinking aloe gel or juice, which is something I'm aware of, and I was wondering, as a gut soothing property, and I was wondering, though, whether there's any kind of preparations that you recommend for that?
Definitely. Aloe is tricky because there are so many different ways of making an aloe juice or a gel. And when we're talking about soothing the gut, what we want is just the inner gel, not the outer or not the whole leaf. There's actually a really bitter part of aloe that's just underneath the rind. It's called the latex, and that's a terrible stimulant laxative. And I'm not a fan of strong stimulant laxatives in almost all situations. And so I actually don't want people to be using the whole leaf, and I want to make sure they're not using that latex, because that can be too irritating, especially if the digestive system is already a little bit irritated. So just the inner gel, and that could be prepared as a juice or a gel. So that can sometimes refer also to the thickness of it, so that can get confusing too. So it can be a juice or a gel, but it's the part that you want is just that inner gel of the aloe, not the whole leaf and not the latex. And they don't taste great necessarily, but some of the brands taste a little bit better than others, so you can kind of play around and see what works for you. I know that one of my students really loves the Georgia aloe, and you can also mix it in with a little juice or something like that, or some people just shoot it real quick and then chase it with something else. Some of the brands, like I said, taste much better and much worse than others. But the aloe is great. It works on the same principles of that it's soothing and healing and slimy, and probably has other activities as well, but especially it kind of falls into that category. So for some people, just taking a shot or two of aloe inner gel a day can be great. I usually wouldn't make your own homemade, just because it's going to be really hard in the home kitchen to avoid getting that latex in the mix.
Yeah, and you can buy organic aloe juice.
Yes, and I would look for something that's organic and all natural. A lot of the aloes do have funky ingredients in them, so look at the ingredients on the back label and make sure there's nothing too weird in them. And you can just enjoy them. Most of them might need to be refrigerated after you open it, and that's good, because if they don't need to be refrigerated after you open it, it's because they've added a lot of preservatives to it.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the lower GI tract. Common symptoms include bloating and gas. And what are some of the best herbal remedies for that?
So in the lower GI, so many different things could be going on. And so that's one of our challenges. As an herbalist, it's really important to try to figure out, or at least guess. As an herbalist, I can't diagnose, but to try to guess and look at the patterns to figure out what's going on in the gut. So if things are out of balance, is it because the gut is moving too slow and we want to move things a little bit faster? Is it that absorption isn't happening and we want to increase absorption and assimilation? Is there a lot of inflammation? Are things getting a little bit leaky and food is leaking out and that's adding to the inflammation? That happens pretty frequently. Are things moving too fast? And so people have more watery stools and they're not absorbing their nutrients for those reasons. So depending on what's going on, that's going to decide what herbs we're going to use. So one of the classic ones that we'll use for gas and pain and bloating, when things are just kind of tight and in a knot and irritated, we'll look at things that are antispasmodic. So fennel seeds are one of my absolute favorites. They'll often work within just a few minutes of chewing the seeds or sipping a really strong tea or some other preparation like that, and you just kind of feel everything relax. And you might actually even get a little bit of gas, but that's okay, because things are moving out. You want to move things out and relax all of that spasm. Peppermint is another really classic one. It's a little bit more dynamic than fennel because peppermint also strongly stimulates digestive juices, and so sometimes people with heartburn find that peppermint makes things worse, and sometimes people with peppermint get better. So it really depends. So you'll listen to your body. Your body will tell you pretty quickly when you're taking herbs whether they agree with you or don't. So I would listen to that. If you take ginger and suddenly everything gets better, then that's great. And if you take ginger and it seems like everything gets worse, then that's a good clue that maybe you don't need that extra stimulation. So ginger is another really good herb that stimulates digestion and assimilation, decreases inflammation, but it's very warming for the gut. So it can be really nice from that perspective as well. So a lot of times people with gas and bloating find it useful. And ginger, more than the other ones, is good at fighting pathogens. So if there are bacteria or yeasts that are overgrown in the gut, ginger is one of the herbs that helps fight the bad guys while also promoting the good bacteria at the same time, which is nice. And a lot of people do have some amount of dysbiosis where their gut bacteria is a little bit off because of antibiotics use, because of stress, because of, a wide range of things that can set off our gut bacteria so that it's not quite as healthy.
Mm-hmm. And ginger also helps improve insulin sensitivity and reduces blood sugar. So
yes, definitely. And the bitters will do that too. So not all the herbs we're talking about, but many of the herbs that we talk about do also affect blood sugar.
Mm-hmm. So when you're talking about preparation, I'm glad you talk about thinly slicing or grating the root, because that's what I do. I like to grate it. The fresh ginger, which is has a wonderful potent smell to it, or aroma, depending on what you want to call it. And I was wondering if you would recommend just adding the grated ginger to just a glass of filtered water, or should it always be heated, the water be warm? Does the water temperature matter?
The water temperature matters to some extent because the heat is going to do a better job extracting the properties of the herb, of the ginger, and so getting more of those spicy, digestion-enhancing properties. Now, one thing you might get a little bit more from the more tepid water or room temperature water would be enzymes. And so enzymes are present in the fresh ginger. You're not really going to get much enzymes from the dry ginger. And ginger does have some protein digesting enzymes and some other compounds. So you might get a little bit more of that if you make a juice of ginger and add that to water, or if you really finely grate it and get that into your water. If you didn't finely grate it, it's going to be really hard to get much of anything out in cold water because you just don't have a lot of extraction in cold water. So the more you break that down, the easier that's going to be. So you could do it either way. I usually heat it, but if you're trying to get some of the digestion-enhancing properties from the enzymes, you might get a little more benefit from the cold. And then it's also what you like. So if somebody really likes it better one way or another, and that's the difference between them taking it or not, then that's fine.
And does it matter if you grate it or just even use some chunks of ginger? So, there's the part of it that's not, the ginger itself is coming through. It's not just the skin or the root, but so you have that in there. But do you recommend always grating it or just even using chunks of the ginger?
It depends on how you're extracting it. So if you're going to simmer your ginger as a tea, then you can have pretty good sized chunks and you're still going to get some benefit from it because the heat from the actual simmering process, we call it a decoction, is going to gradually pull that out. If you were just going to steep it in hot water, then we don't have as much extraction. We've got heat, but it's not that prolonged heat. And so thinly slicing it might be okay, but grating it is going to be better. And then if you're using tepid water, then it's even more important that it's really finely grated or minced or even juiced, because you're not going to have, cold water does not really extract things very well for the most part. You could also kind of compensate by time. So if you let it sit longer, you may eventually get more out of it, but you're not going to get much in like 15 to 30 minutes if you just took some chunks of ginger and put them in cold water. It's just the cold water's not going to pull out very much. If you let it sit for hours, then it might compensate for that a little bit.
Yeah, do you have a favorite?
I tend to like to use a really strong thermos, like a thermos that holds heat very, very well. And I've got one that's like a little commuter mug, so it's got small sippy holes at the top. And so I'll slice my ginger really thinly, put it in there with hot water, and it'll stay hot for the whole day. And then after about an hour or so, I might start sipping doing it. And that one, it keeps the water so hot that I actually have to add ice cubes after a while so that I can drink it safely out of the container. And so that's better. If I have a cheaper thermos that the outside is warm but the inside doesn't really stay so hot, then those ones I would be more apt to grate it so that I can get a better extraction out of the ginger.
I'll have to try that. So I noticed under peppermint, and I admit I'm talking about some of my own issues here, but I get wake up with very congested sinuses, which could have nothing to do with digestion, but more that I have some allergies, external or environmental allergies, including cat dander. But I was noticing that peppermint can also clear the sinuses. So how would you do that if you wanted that particular effect?
Well, if you're going to try to clear your sinuses, then a peppermint tea might actually work, but the goal is to really be inhaling. So if you're drinking a cup of tea, you're inhaling at the same time, and you're also delivering those essential oils to your head and your throat, that kind of area, because that's where it's going to be hitting. So a tea would be great, or you could just inhale the essential oil. You could vaporize it. They've got those little fancy vaporizers that you can put it into the air and work on it that way. You could just sniff it right from the bottle. And so those are all great ways if you're dealing with sinuses. Peppermint kind of helps open things up. It relaxes spasms. It gets the juices going in the body. If you're trying to address something in the lower GI, like let's say you have really bad IBS and pain and gas, peppermint's great for that, but the essential oils aren't really going to make it all the way down into the gut because they get broken down before they reach that point in your stomach and everything else. So usually for that, we'll use a enteric-coated peppermint capsule where they put the peppermint essential oil that's been diluted into a pill that's designed to not break down in the stomach, but to break down in the intestines. And so that's where we see the most research for peppermint for like the lower GI. But if you're looking to clear the sinuses, then you want to deliver it more quickly to the upper part of the body.
Well, that makes sense. So let's talk about elimination or moving things along. Can you talk a little bit about, again, the importance of being hydrated, reducing stress, and then specifically some herbs and astringents, I believe, is the category here.
So we've got different things that could be going on in the lower GI. We could have it moving too quickly, and we end up with diarrhea, or we could have it moving too slowly, and we end up with constipation. So do you have one that you want me to address first?
Why don't we talk about diarrhea?
Okay. So with diarrhea, things are moving too quickly, and first it's a good idea to figure out what is going on with the diarrhea. Like, why is that happening? If it's because somebody is really sick, then that's going to be a factor. So if somebody's got a bug, then you want the diarrhea to be moving things out, and you want to just kind of make sure that the person stays really hydrated and make sure their electrolytes there, because that's the biggest threat there in acute diarrhea, is that they are going to become dehydrated. And dehydrated isn't just about replacing your water, but you also need to replace the electrolytes at the same time. So that can be really helpful there. And then we're going to also look at our astringent remedies, so remedies that tighten and tone the tissues and help stop the diarrhea. So that would be more like later stages of acute diarrhea, where we're concerned about the prolonged, that it might not be so good for health. And then we might also use that in chronic diarrhea. And if you have chronic diarrhea, it's still a good idea to go to the GI, find out, do you have a parasite? Do you have some kind of infection that's keeping things going? They might be able to identify a specific cause of that diarrhea that might lead to more specific herbal remedies or more specific medications to address it. But there are a lot of great herbs for people who have chronic diarrhea. And one of my favorites is cinnamon because it's very astringent. And astringent things tend to be high in tannins. Tannins are compounds that tighten and tone. They'll actually take the protein compounds in the tissues and knit them together a little bit. And so we use tannins that are much stronger when we're turning skin into leather. So if you take expose that cowhide to enough tannins, it'll ultimately turn it into waterproof leather. We don't want our gut to be that waterproof, but it's the same basic concept with much gentler tannins that we're using. So cinnamon is a great favorite, one of my favorites. It also tastes good. It also stimulates good digestion, and it has some antimicrobial benefits. So those are all really nice things. And the cinnamon powder is great, or a really strong cinnamon tea. And then we can also also use other astringents, like raspberry leaf is a gentle astringent. A lot of our rose family plants have gentle astringents. So raspberry leaf, rose petals are classic. In slightly stronger cases, when we need something a little bit stronger, you might use blackberry root as an extract. It's a little stronger than the raspberry leaf. So those are all rose family astringents. And there are many others, but those are some of the classic ones that I've used in chronic diarrhea and digestive issues.
Mm-hmm. And that's also, it could be either perhaps constipation or diarrhea, but people with irritable bowel syndrome often have a lot of inflammation and inflammatory bowel disease, of course. So would you recommend these herbs for these conditions?
It can be really useful. I mean, you may need to do other things to address the inflammation more directly, the autoimmune components that sometimes go alongside with inflammatory bowel disease, and diet can be really huge. You know, somebody who's got chronic diarrhea, a lot of times there's a food sensitivity going on alongside. And even if they didn't have food sensitivities, if things are moving really quickly, they're not breaking down food as well as possible, the gut tends to become more leaky, and then we have food particles getting out into the bloodstream, or even more so into the interstitial spaces of the body, and the body is going to start mounting an immune response to the body itself, an autoimmune disease, and then also to those compounds, so that you'll start to develop more food allergies as that goes along. So one of the other big things, if you see chronic diarrhea going on, is figuring out what those trigger foods are and eliminating them. And once you get the gut healed back up again, using slimy soothing herbs and anti-inflammatory herbs and healing herbs and the astringent herbs, you might find that eventually some people can eat some of those foods again, but maybe certain ones may always have to be avoided. It really depends. So diarrhea can be a really complicated case, but usually if I see somebody having diarrhea, I'll especially have them look at gluten intake. Dairy and eggs tend to be the ones that I see most often aggravating those conditions.
Mm-hmm. Right. I noticed that you also mentioned abdominal massage, but also using rubbing a little bit of essential oil on the belly to have a...
Yeah, that's not going to address the diarrhea specifically, but it can be a nice way to help with the gas and bloating. And so just kind of moving things along a little bit better. So you could take something like some diluted peppermint or diluted fennel essential oil. You want to dilute it in some vegetable oils. Essential oils straight on the skin are usually contraindicated. And so we're going to want to put just a little bit of that, massage that in, and then you can massage your belly going from, you're following the line of your large intestine. So you start on the right side, work your way up, and then across, and then down, and that would help move food through. And that can also be really helpful when people are tight and have a lot of gas and bloating and constipation.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about constipation. What are some of the herbs that you recommend? It seems like you have different phases, phase 1 and phase 2.
So with constipation, I like to look at the holistic picture. So, why are they constipated? Is it because they're stressed? So is it because their digestion is moving slowly? So we might address stress. We might also address, added bitters. If their digestive system just seems slow, digestive bitters are going to indirectly be a little bit laxative by just stimulating the peristalsis and stimulating digestion. So those are good places to start. Are they eating enough fiber and getting enough water? Because those are also going to help bulk up the stools. If somebody is really constipated and you just suddenly add a bunch of fiber, that usually makes things worse, because now they've got even more that they're backed up with. And fiber is harder to digest if your body's not used to it. If you don't have good bacteria in your intestines, then it's harder to break down fiber. That's what the bacteria like to eat. But the bacteria aren't really there. The good bacteria aren't there. And so it's better to sort of slowly introduce fiber alongside plenty of water to keep that all nice and bulked up. But over the long haul, we need to eat more fiber in our daily diet, and maybe also take a fiber, like a real fiber supplement, like ground up flax seeds or ground up psyllium seeds. And obeying the urge is really important. Moving is important, and just staying well hydrated in general is really important. So that's kind of phase 1. And then there would be a phase 2 would be the sort of mid-range herbs that have a little bit more direct of a laxative action, but they're gentle laxatives. And my favorite is yellow dock root. That has some of these compounds that we call androquinone glycosides. They're the main laxative compound that's in some of our herbs. But it doesn't have a lot. It has a little bit, also has a little bit of those tannins that have that binding effect. And so yellow dock ends up being a really nice colon tonic. You see it being recommended for both diarrhea and constipation because it has a normalizing effect. And that's my favorite herb to use for somebody who really does seem to need at least a little boost of a laxative. You don't need to take a lot. In fact, if you decide like, hey, little is good, more is better, and you take a lot of yellow dock, people could end up with explosive diarrhea followed by really bad constipation. So just, maybe like a half a teaspoon or a couple dropperfuls of the tincture or a little bit of the herb in a cup of tea that you have simmered or decocted is usually more than enough. And then another herb or herb formula that's very similar to that is triphala. And that is an Ayurvedic blend of 3 fruits that also have a little bit of those agrocanooglycosides that are laxative and a little bit of some gentle tannins and have that normalizing effect. So usually that's as far as I go with laxatives. I'm not a fan of the really heavy-duty laxatives, but in extreme situations, if somebody's really just backed up, maybe they're traveling and they haven't pooped in a week, or they just went through surgery and the anesthesia and other drugs that they give you during surgery can just shut down peristalsis completely, and they just need to get that moving, then stronger laxatives might be more appropriate. And those would be like cascara, senna, that aloe latex that we talked about before. Buckthorn and turkey rhubarb are similar, but maybe a little bit gentler than that aloe and the senna and the cascara. So those would be some classic stronger laxatives. Those are habit forming in the long run. They actually sort of bypass your body's natural ways of eliminating, and so as time goes on, you will even more so need those laxatives in order to have a bowel movement. They're not necessarily dangerous, but they don't seem to increase your cancer risk, but they will ultimately atrophy the colon if they go in with a colonoscopy. If you've been using a lot of laxatives, they might start to see black spots where there's been some atrophy of the colon. So I don't like them, but sometimes occasional use is fine, and like Smooth Move tea by Traditional Medicinals is one that I wouldn't recommend regularly, but in that occasional use, a cup of Smooth Move tea can be really effective.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I like about Traditional Medicinals is that they do list the quantity of each herb that they're using, like 500 milligrams, I believe, and so on, which is helpful, I think, don't you?
Yeah, it is nice. And they're just a really ethical company overall. They're one of the better herbal blend formulas, herbal product tea companies that is available in the general public, that's available in tea bag form. Generally, I'm not a huge fan of tea bag teas. They're usually not as potent, but if you needed to buy something in a pinch, that's one of the better brands out there. They're generally mostly organic, and they're just a really ethical company overall. There are other great companies too, but that's just one of the ones that's really easy to get.
Yeah, exactly. Even Safeway is carrying them now.
Yeah, everybody has them, so that's great. Normally in my practice and in my personal use, I buy bulk organic herbs, or I grow and harvest and dry my own bulk organic herbs, and then I make my tea from those loose herbs, and that's going to make a more potent cup of tea than pretty much anything in a tea bag, but it's not always convenient for people, so you kind of have to meet people where they're at.
Exactly. And I just want to mention that you have a great at-a-glance chart at the end of this chapter, herbs for digestion and elimination, and you break it down by upper GI and lower GI. So listeners, you can refer to that as well. So moving on
there are lots of charts throughout the book. I'm slightly OCD, so I like to make charts and lists for people to kind of make a quick reference with.
Yeah, well, I think it's very helpful. So let's talk about cleanup time, detoxification. I know people are probably not thinking about that necessarily right now. New Year seems to be a good time for that, but it's never too soon to start. So what are some great herbs for, well, let's talk first about the role of the liver, and then talk about some herbs that can help detox the liver.
Sure. Well, we can look at the liver as doing two main things. One is it's one of our most important detoxification organs, and it's only one of several organs that detoxifies our body of various toxins and metabolic waste throughout the day. But it's one of the biggies, and it acts on a lot of the chemical compounds that we think of as toxins, as well as some of the just day-to-day metabolic waste. So, your body's getting rid of old cholesterol, it's getting rid of old hormones, it deals a lot with that. So as your liver purifies the blood, and that's mainly what the liver is working on, is purifying the blood. It will pull that waste out, and that's in the form of bile, which we mentioned before. And then the bile gets excreted into the digestive tract. That's the easiest way out, and it gets held in the gallbladder. And then as your body is moving food out of the stomach into the intestines, that gallbladder should kind of splurk out that bile, and it helps us digest our food a little bit better, but then also gets it out of the body. If you don't have a gallbladder, then you still produce and excrete bile. It just tends to kind of trickle out throughout the day, as opposed to having this, one big splurk, as you're having a meal. So it makes it, you might have a little bit harder time digesting food, especially digesting fat, if you don't have a gallbladder, because you don't get that big splurk. But you still have the same basic process going on. The other big thing that the liver does is it's a great metabolizer. It's constantly shifting things from one form to another and in and out of storage. So sugar, it will put it into the bloodstream regardless of what you're eating. It can take it out of storage and put it into the bloodstream, like if you're under a lot of stress. The liver will do that because it thinks you need that extra fuel for fighting or fleeing. And it will also take sugar and put it into storage, store it, like say, into fat cells. And it will take cholesterol and shift around from some of the different forms that we've got for cholesterol and triglycerides. And it will take hormones and shift the forms of the hormones around and activate them or deactivate them. Iron, it'll put it into storage or out of storage. So your liver is one of the main organs that kind of determines all of those things. So it's a very important thing. And during the day, it's really going to be more focused on dealing with what's coming through because of digestion and what you're eating, and just that day-to-day need of we need to shift this in or out of storage. At night, and when you're relaxing, is when it's going to be more focused on the general detoxification of the body and cleaning things out. So, old blood cells, that's what's actually turning your feces brown, is the bilirubin and the color pigments of that it gets from those old red blood cells. So it'll kind of clean things through. So it's not just cleaning out what we think of as regular toxins, but also just, if you're eating a high sugar diet or you're eating foods that you're sensitive to, that's going to create a little bit more metabolic waste in the body, and so the liver's going to have to clean that out. And just stuff that just happens. We are kind of a factory producing different compounds, and we've got some waste as part of the daily energy use, and so our body is going to break those down primarily through the liver and excrete those.
So you have this phrase, liver movers. What are some examples of that?
So liver movers are particularly our bitter herbs, and the liver movers, by that I mean herbs that are going to help encourage the liver to do more detoxifying, to produce more bile from excreting, from pulling together that waste, and then also excrete more bile through the digestive tract. And so a lot of the same herbs that we would use as digestive bitters also work as great liver movers. So we have things like artichoke leaf, we have gentian root. I don't use that one as much for sustainability reasons, but artichoke leaf is one of my biggies. But gentian is another really popular one. And we also have things like dandelion root, burdock root, yellow dock root has some liver moving capabilities as well. Bitter orange peel, the bitter tasting orange peels and citrus peels have some liver moving activity. And then we have some herbs that both protect the liver and regenerate the liver as well as move the liver. And so turmeric and schizandra berries are particularly good for that. And then there's milk thistle, which isn't as much of a liver mover. It's more of just a liver protector and a regenerator. So it's good when you think your actual liver needs a little TLC. But I don't generally use that to move the liver and to improve detoxification directly.
So the difference between a liver protector and a liver mover is what?
So the liver movers are generally going to increase the production and excretion of bile, so they're increasing detoxification. And the liver protectors are going to act directly on the liver as an organ itself to protect the liver itself from toxins, because that can create damage as time goes on.
Sure.
And then also help to some extent, regenerate the liver if there's been damage to the liver. So let's say somebody's consuming a lot of alcohol, that can be really damaging to the body. And another, some medications are toxic to the liver. And another example would be if we're eating a really high sugar diet, all of that that's associated with that can also create some issues with the liver. We can end up with fatty liver disease, and some of our liver protectors can be helpful there as well.
Yes.
And those are complicated issues. So this is not like I've got fatty liver disease, I'm just going to take milk thistle and everything will be all better. But that's just one thing that can be part of that protocol to help with that situation.
Right. And, when you mentioned tannins, I was curious about red wine, for example, contains tannin usually. Is that any way to get tannins in your diet?
No, I probably wouldn't turn to red wine as a way to get tannins. No, I mean, I would. If you want red wine, you're drinking the benefits from that would be more from the alcohol itself, and then also from the polyphenols, which are a type of tannin in a way, but those like pigments that are really good for us do have some relationship to those tannin compounds, but they're kind of a different set of them. So so you get some benefits from that, but not so much.
Right.
Not the tannins that tighten and tone your tissues. And you don't want too many tannins. Those really strong tannins over time can make it so that you don't absorb nutrients as well, and they can also irritate the kidneys. So you want just kind of like a little bit when you need it, and then on from there. And when it comes to liver and detoxification, I really don't see tannins playing a big role in that at all.
Okay. And then what about Dandy Blend? Are you familiar with that? It's a coffee alternative, and they use extracts, I believe, from the root and the leaves, along with chicory. And it's a powder, which I like, and you can use it in a coffee maker. And so, are you familiar with that?
I am familiar with Dandy Blend. It's a nice blend. It's a nice way to kind of do something a little bit different from coffee. It's a little bit more focused on the liver. And coffee does have some liver moving capabilities because it is a digestive bitter too, but it's not quite as good at that, I think, as things like burdock and dandelion and chicory root. And so Dandy Blend, I wouldn't consider it quite as potent medicinally as if you were using the actual crude cut herbs yourself and making a tea from those, but it's a lot more convenient because you just add this powder to water and it dissolves kind of like instant coffee would, and it tastes pretty good. There's a little bit more carbohydrate in it as well to make it taste a little bit sweeter. If I remember correctly, it might have barley. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I know that it also has beets in it, and those are mainly to sweeten it up a little bit. But it does have a lot of traditional liver tonics in it, so that can be kind of a nice baby step towards being a little bit nicer to your liver. It's kind of like having tea in tea bags. It's not quite as potent as making it with the herbs themselves, but it can be really convenient, and if it makes it convenient, makes it easier for somebody, then that's awesome.
Right, and I frankly have it almost every day, especially in the winter. So is there a cumulative effect to that?
You would be getting just some general liver benefits from that, just from improving detoxification. A lot of those herbs are also kind of diuretic, so you might notice that you pee a little bit more. Coffee is diuretic too, for that matter, and so is tea. But in the case of those herbs, they're also helping by acting on the kidneys to help the kidneys flush out toxins a little bit more efficiently too. So you get a little bit of benefit there as well.
And then, what do you also think about turmeric as a spice, which is, again, we're talking more convenient forms here, using the turmeric, in your cooking?
So turmeric in cooking is a great way of using it. And in fact, when we look at the epidemiological studies, which epidemiological studies are when we look at like what people are already doing and what health outcomes do they have, we just kind of make associations with that. When we see that lots of benefits, when we look at people, they're using them as a spice. We look at India and the health benefits that they seem to be getting from having a lot of turmeric in their diet. They're not taking it in full form. They're putting it in their food on a regular basis. And we know that with turmeric, when we heat it, when we add spices, and when we add some fat, those are all going to make the compounds in turmeric work better and be better absorbed than if you just down a spoonful of turmeric powder or something. Mix just a little bit of that in water and that was it. So definitely getting it in the food is great. I know that there is also a way of making turmeric tea that's popular in Okinawa, but around here we tend to do more with golden milk, where you combine turmeric powder with some kind of hot fatty milk. So it could be cow's milk, it could also be hemp milk or almond milk or coconut milk, and that you're getting your heat and your fat there, and then maybe add like a little pinch of black pepper and maybe some other spices for flavor like cardamom, and if you want to sweeten it a little bit with honey, you could.
That sounds great.
So yeah, it's very tasty.
So why don't we end with the colon? We don't want to forget that. What is the role of the colon in elimination, and what are some of your favorite herbs for that?
Sure. So we talked a little bit about the colon already when we were talking about diarrhea and constipation. And the main role of the colon is to just kind of like pull out whatever fluid is necessary and then eliminate the waste. But when it comes to detoxification, it's important to keep in mind that you do still want to be having regular bowel movements when you're doing detoxification, because a lot of the detoxification is occurring through your liver, going into the bile, and then the toxins are excreted out through your colon as feces. And so if you're really constipated, as you're sitting there reabsorbing all that fluid, you will also reabsorb some of those toxins back into your body again. So you don't necessarily need to be having diarrhea or like 6 bowel movements a day, but you do want to be having at least 1 to 3 regular bowel movements to help keep that waste moving out. And that's just for general health, but especially if you're doing a detox and you're maybe having some of these detox-friendly herbs, maybe you're doing some diet things as well that help encourage detoxification, you want to make sure that the bowels are going. And a lot of the cleanse kits that are out there are really mostly just laxatives, which is sort of a little simplistic in my mind, but it does point to how moving things through can be really helpful. And a lot of times people feel more toxic when they are more constipated. And, some of that might be imagined, but then some of that is real, and that we just are not going to be eliminating toxins as efficiently if we're not eliminating our bowels really frequently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is so true. It's really important.
And the herbs that we talked about already are really helpful for that. So we're looking at high fiber in our diet, and then things that have gentle laxative action. So the digestive bitters, yellow dock, triphala, those would be the ones I would primarily turn to if in those extreme cases, maybe short term for a day or two. The stronger laxatives might be okay, but normally I don't turn to those at all.
Mm-hmm. And I want to add that you have a good recipe here for a deep cleanse tea as well.
Yes, and that's based off of, there's a tea that's made by the company Flora. They used to be called Bija, but now they're Flora. And they have a deep cleanse tea, and this is sort of my knockoff of that. But it's a really nice, tasty tea that is also good for detoxification on a variety of levels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So listeners, give that a try as well. So I want to thank you so much for being on the podcast again today, Maria.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I want to mention, too, that we just covered part 1 of your book in these 2 podcasts. So I encourage everyone to buy Maria's book. Again, it's called Body into Balance, an Herbal Guide to Holistic Self Care. And it's available on her website, which is wintergreenbotanicals.com. And
I do have it on sale right now through January 1st. So you can get a discount if you order it through me, and you'll get a signed copy, which is nice.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yes. So next episode, my monthly co-host and fellow nutritional therapy practitioner, Amy Berger, and I will talk about news, research, and trends in food, nutrition, and science. So everyone, have a great week and be well.